Welcome back. To summarize the last couple of mini lectures, I talked about the debate between the nation-centered view of federalism, and the nation-centered view rests on two constitutional principles: Article 6, that all-important supremacy clause, and Article 1, Section 8, most notably the necessary and proper clause. The nation-centered view of federalism held in the McCulloch case, McCulloch versus Maryland, where John Marshall ruled that the U.S. government could charter a national bank, establishing the doctrine of implied powers. The state-centered view of federalism rests on the 10th Amendment. Justice Taney invoked the 10th Amendment to protect the power of the states, and he did this most notably in the Dred Scott case. Remember, in the Dred Scott case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Congress could not regulate slavery in the territories, and struck down the Missouri Compromise, declaring it unconstitutional. Today I want to continue the discussion, but in a very different way, of battles of federalism. And this is labeled in your notes, Two Competing Visions of Federalism. And while I am going to treat them separately, here's what I really believe about federalism. Federalism, in many ways, is like a marriage. Right? In an ideal world, people talk about marriage as a purely cooperative relationship, right? You go to a wedding and you see the two candles light the unity candle, and we're stronger than the sum of our parts, right? And that whole bit. In reality, however, in a marriage, you're dealing with two people who are imperfect. And while there certainly are lots of arenas of cooperation, there's competition too, because people want different things. And so in federalism, yes, the national government in the states are competitors, and I illustrated that in the previous couple of mini lectures, but the U.S. government and the states also cooperate in a whole variety of areas, and I'll get into that. So I'm going to disaggregate them. What we've talked about so far, all of the mini lectures up to this point, have discussed federalism during what we call dual federalism. Dual federalism. And as your notes point out, in this vision of federalism, the national government and the states are primarily competitors with separate powers, separate responsibilities, and it is the U.S. Supreme Court that serves as an umpire to resolve disputes between the actors. And certainly I illustrated that in the last few mini lectures. In McCulloch versus Maryland and in Dred Scott, it was the U.S. Supreme Court that acted as the umpire to resolve disputes between the actors. The U.S. government prevailed or won in the McCulloch case, and the U.S. government lost in the Dred Scott case. And this was the dominant view of American federalism up until the Great Depression, that the U.S. government and the states were competitors, and that the U.S. Supreme Court would resolve disputes as they occurred. Now, that does not mean that the states and the national government never cooperated, because there's a whole bunch of examples of this. And the best example of this for me are the creation of the land-grant colleges. I know one summer I had the pleasure of attending the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. That university was a cooperative endeavor where the U.S. government gave the state of Michigan a large grant of land to create a university. I believe the University of Illinois, the University of Iowa, several universities were created this way. So when I'm talking about dual federalism, the emphasis is on competition. The emphasis is on the Supreme Court stepping in as a referee. It does not mean that there was not any cooperation, because there clearly was. The Great Depression changes things in a fundamental way, and you guys have already figured out I like to rank things. And to me, the Great Depression is the second greatest crisis in American history. I'll talk a lot more about this event as we go along. But with the Great Depression, the view of federalism changes to cooperative federalism. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next several mini lectures. Cooperative federalism. In this view, the national government and the states are primarily partners with shared powers and shared responsibilities. And as I pointed out, and you should know, this has been the dominant view of federalism since the Great Depression. And let me give you some examples of cooperative federalism. If any of you have ever driven down Highway 99, and I'm guessing that's almost everyone in the room, just an interesting tidbit. Highway 99 is the deadliest highway in the United States of any highway that's 100 miles or longer. So for those of you who don't think you're thrill seekers, if you've driven the highway, you've been a thrill seeker. But perhaps you've been irritated because as you were driving on 99, traffic snarled to a stop. You saw a big sign, and the sign said, "Your tax dollars at work." And if you look at the sign, it'll say something like, this highway construction project is being jointly funded by the U.S. DOT, that's the U.S. Department of Transportation, and Caltrans, California Transportation. So in that particular case, that project is a cooperative project. The U.S. government and the state of California are working on that highway for you. I'll give you one from childhood. My mom and dad, when they got divorced the first time and the second time, they got married, they got divorced, they got remarried, they got re-divorced, then they went on to marry other people because they got bored with each other. But if you look at that period, there was a period of time where I was a recipient of a free government-sponsored lunch, the free lunch program, the childhood nutrition program, and I'll talk about that more later. It is one of the 4 costliest grant programs in the United States, but I think it's a good investment. In that particular case, the program was underwritten by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They're the ones that set the main standards. I don't know if they still do this, but when I was a child, as you would enter the cafeteria, they had this so-called food pyramid where every week you were supposed to have so many servings of fruit, of vegetables, of dairy, of meat, etc. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture told the local school districts how many servings of each thing you have to serve at lunch for your kids. But then the local school district got to determine, well, okay, Monday's green beans and Tuesday's peas and Wednesday's corn, and you get the idea. But there was cooperation there. The U.S. government and local school districts were cooperating to provide healthy school lunches to school children. So that's another great example of cooperative federalism. During this pandemic that has resulted in the deaths of way too many Americans, the last time I looked, it was over 175,000. A couple of my old classmates, they were a couple of years ahead of me in school, but I heard have died of this, and I currently know a family I'm pretty close to where 4 members of the family caught this pandemic. But you'll notice that there's cooperation between the Center for Disease Control, the feds, and state and local health agencies with immunizations, with testings. There's not immunizations yet, but they're trying to work on a vaccine, right? They don't have a vaccine as of this recording, but they're sharing information. They're talking about spread. They're talking about positivity rates. And there's a lot of cooperation between the federal and state actors in this pandemic. So federalism has elements of competition. They still exist, but there are also huge elements of cooperation. Before the Great Depression, those of us who study federalism stress the competition. Since the Great Depression, we usually stress the cooperation. Both have always been present. Put some stars next to what comes next, the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment occurs before the Great Depression. It occurs in 1913. But the Great Depression created a situation where they made use of this income tax, and I'll talk about that in the next mini lecture. Keep in mind that in 1895, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a federal income tax was illegal. It was unconstitutional. And as I told you in a previous mini lecture, the 16th Amendment was ratified by the states in 1913. And the significance of the federal income tax is that it has contributed to the national government becoming the controlling partner in federalism. So there are two potential exam questions there, so you should put lots of stars next to it in your notes. You should know that the 16th Amendment created the federal income tax. That's one potential question. And the other, you should know that the national government has become the controlling partner in federalism because they control the purse strings. As I mentioned earlier, the national government gives state and local governments over $750 billion a year. And if you are dependent on someone for that much money, they have a lot of power and a lot of influence over you. And by power, I simply mean the ability to get you to do something you wouldn't otherwise do. Power is a behavior. Let me give you an example. Many years ago, not many, but several years ago, the U.S. government told states that we want you to impose a DUI standard, driving under the influence, that we want your standard to be 0.10 or more restrictive. In California, it happens to be 0.08. Most states said fine, no problem. In fact, most states already had DUI standards of 0.10 or more restrictive. So most states were like, done, we already did it. But there were some states who didn't want to do this, and the state that stands out in this discussion is the state of Louisiana. Louisiana said that we do not want to impose a DUI standard of 0.10, and then Louisiana said, and that is a power that we have as a state. Just like we as a state, we have the power to set speed limits on our highways, and you can't force us to set a national standard. You cannot force us to set a DUI standard. And the U.S. government told Louisiana, we agree. We cannot force you to impose a DUI standard of 0.10. But if you do not impose a DUI standard of 0.10, next year we'll take away 10% of your health care funding. And in year 2, we'll take away 20%. And in year 3, 30%. And then you can figure out how to backfill that money and get that money to take care of your health care funding on your own. So basically, what the national government told states is that if you want this pot of money for health care, one of the conditions is that you have to impose a DUI standard of 0.10. Sort of like a parent telling a child, right, that if you want your allowance, you have to clean up your room. You don't have to clean up your room, but if you don't, you won't get your allowance. And that is, in essence, what the national government told Louisiana. We can't force you to set this DUI standard that we want states to have. But if you want this pot of money, you have to do it. And of course, as you can guess, the state of Louisiana very reluctantly agreed and set a DUI standard of 0.10. And so the point of the story is that when you talk about ways in which the national government can prevail over the states, one is obviously to go to court. That's what happened in McCulloch versus Maryland. But increasingly what the national government does is that it ties money to federal objectives, and you need to do what the feds say to get the money. We'll talk about the Great Depression in the next mini lecture. Have a great day.